My name is Steven W. Holden. I am a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, finance officer. I was born and raised in Oklahoma on a dairy farm, and I am also of Native American heritage, where I'm Cherokee, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Choctaw. I came here to Central and Western New York in about 2006 when the Army sent me to Syracuse University, to the Whitman School of Business, and to the Maxwell School of Public Administration and Citizenship to get my master's degrees. There I met my beautiful wife, Julie, and between the two of us, we have 3 children who will be 29 and 30 this year, one of whom is in the U.S. Air Force Reserves. My children live in the Atlanta metro area, along with my grandson, Tyrion, who just turned 6. I'm running because I believe I understand what's going on in this district. This is a diverse district. Everything from military communities up in Watertown to union communities in Western New York with Native American land in between and lots of agriculture. It's what I was grown up around, and I think I best suit the voters here within this district. No, I have not. I was, with my over 20 years in the military, I'm very familiar with how it operates and how to live on the other side of policy. I have been involved in Democratic politics since 1990 when I was a Young Democrats campus chair. I turned 50 this year, so about 32 years ago. And even when I was in uniform at night, I'd take that off and go help Democrats get elected. And I've lived in every time zone. So from coast to coast, I've made that happen. Well, I know that it's kind of at a crossroads. It's in between the Buffalo and Rochester areas. There's a lot of agricultural communities here, along with communities like Batavia, who are medium-sized towns. It's more diverse than what you think, but yet the people here are like a lot of other places in Western and Central New York. That we have driving in, I noticed we had solar farms coming out here. So we have renewable energy that's going on. Those are some of the things I like about Genesee County, as well as I think that we have a burgeoning movement out here. From the discussions, there's a lot of passion behind it. And those are some of the things I know about Genesee County. My basic political philosophy is that it's about equality of opportunity. It's making sure we have a level playing field so everybody out there has the same shot to live the American dream. Again, like I said, I came from a small town and a dairy farm, and I went on to serve over 20 years in the military. You know, I want to create a society where anybody can be able to do that, and they're not limited by where they live, what they believe, or what God they worship. I believe that is up to you, as well as it's rebuilding rural America. Rural America has been forgotten, and there are many different problems with that, which throughout the campaign I'm going to address. But we're going to bring rural America back. I'd like to get back into sort of classical political philosophy. I've been a big fan of the writings of John Locke, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, and just kind of looking at the political evolution and how those have really defined some of the greatest political movements that we've had, that have influenced Western democracy. Whether that is the more conservative movement under Hobbes, the more centrist and classical liberalism under Locke, or more of the what we call modern day liberalism that we found under Rousseau. So I kind of go back to the classics on that.
Well, that's a wide range there, because you brought up, I was surprised to hear both Locke and Rousseau in the same sentence. How do you reconcile their really different views of culture and society?
Well, what I do is I try to incorporate that into my thinking so I can understand where people who may or may not agree with me stand. You know, it's easier to formulate policy and listen to people if you understand kind of where that thinking came from. And when you do that, you can formulate that into really good policy, and be able to reach out to very different people. Because, again, this is a diverse district, this is a diverse state, and we need to be listening to everybody. So if you understand where they're coming from, that helps out a good bit.
Do you consider yourself progressive?
I do consider myself a progressive, but I take it more in the populist vein. The big thing that you're going to hear about in this campaign is how, the very wealthy, the elite, they've left everybody behind. We're mad about the same things. You're upset about taxes, we're upset about taxes. You're upset about inflation, we're upset about inflation. So we want to solve those problems. And that's kind of the way that I take a look at myself. I call myself a practical progressive, which means, it's going to it's not just progressivism for progressivism's sake. It's going to be, it's based upon fact, it's based upon policy, and it's not just, $10 words that are thrown out there. There's actually some thought behind it.
Does progressivism mean using government to try to correct all of society's social ills and society's ills and make society more perfect?
Well, what it means is it's kind of getting what we pay for. If you are spending tax dollars to incentivize an economy, it's better than it's just in the context of Genesee County and rural America. When you have that money that's going to corporate farms or big box stores that are coming in and killing mom and pop shops, be like if a Starbucks came in down the street and closed up here at the coffee press. It's where's that money going? My background is finance and contracting. I was a finance officer in the Army, and I teach that for a living, and I help people use that to be able to grow their businesses. But I understand there's a finite amount within the economy. It's just where does it need to go, and where do we need to prioritize it, and who there out there needs to streamline the system so everybody pays their fair share and gets things taken care of, where we're not shooting billionaires up into space just for the whim of it, or trying to buy Twitter for $45 billion. It's actually having that money to go to the general good and to the general welfare.
Well, isn't that their private funds? If they want to spend it on going up into space, shouldn't they be allowed to spend their money since they earned it? The difference is in that situation is that they benefited from this society. They came in here. They used our governmental constructs. They used our labor force, and so the intent of the public good is to pay back for the public good. So if you benefited from society, you should give back into that at just measure. Everybody into their own. That's kind of what Karl Marx said.
Yeah, that's each man into his own, but it's not Marxism at all. What it is it's simply saying, if you benefit from society, you should have to pay back. You should pay back in like everybody else does. Yeah, whereas we're not talking about the public takeover of goods or the means of production or anything.
Do you think there should be no billionaires in society?
I don't have a problem with billionaires. I just think people have to have that everybody needs to contribute back in. That's my belief. A certain misconception out there is that Democrats, progressives like that aren't capitalists. We are. I own my own business. So yeah, I want to turn a profit in my own. However, I want to create a level playing field where everybody has a shot, and not skew it one way or the other. It's what we would call equality of opportunity, whereas Marx would call that equality of condition. It's equality of opportunity, not equality of condition.
Another off-script question, thoughts on modern monetary theory?
This is an interesting discussion that I have with my son, who had got his degree in econometrics from Georgia State University. And recently, he and a few buddies just started a company. This is important now because of the inflation situation. We take a look at the what the Federal Reserve should and should not do, and cannot do. I believe it can have an impact. I believe that for solving the inflation problem, there's 2 or 3 steps that we could take. So if the Fed goes out there and raises interest rates, you have to take a look at this as an equilibrium. Because if they go out and raise interest rates, well, that's going to that's going to curtail growth. Because especially where you take a look at the leading economic indicators in society, such as new home sales. New home sales is something that it is a good benchmark and measure of a growing and healthy economy. But if you want to control inflation, one of the things you want to do is take less money. Is get less money out of society. So that's a potential way to do it right there, utilizing the Fed's authority to raise interest rates to be able to do that. But then you get into the issue on home sales about private equity firms buying them up and driving up prices and so forth and so on, which is another issue that you could get into. But specifically when it comes to monetary policy, I believe it can, regulating the amount of money regulating amount of money in society. It's a bobber that goes up and down.
I was mainly asking about with modern monetary theory, the idea that since the government controls its own money supply, it can spend as much as it wants.
I don't subscribe to that theory because I'm a progressive who believes there is a finite amount. It's a matter of racking and stacking our priorities on that. That's just the financial manager in me that does that. Where again, it's people on the other side of the aisle differ where that's going to be. So I believe that there has to be a what we call a trade-off, what we call in government finance kind of a trade-off theory to go on there. You can increase the amount with the way that I spoke about and get our priorities, but I do understand that. But the government, I don't believe the government should be just printing its own money and just spending willy-nilly, because that's also going to create inflation if you do that. So that's something that could be curtailed back. But I'm willing to look at some options to be able to, from various different theories, to be able to do that.
Both the Republicans and Democrats during coronavirus approved spending what turned out to be about $10 billion in economic aid, stimulus, pumping that into the economy. I think with the benefit of hindsight, good move, bad move.
I think it had to be done because you needed to stimulate the economy at that particular time. That's rather like even though Republicans and Democrats did, that's a Keynesian methodology to do that, which is kind of where I'm more skewed toward the Keynesian side of it. But it had to be done. You had businesses that were going under, particularly you saw it everywhere, particularly in small towns, people closing up shops, mom and pop stores. One of the biggest problems we had with it, and I was speaking with folks from the Department of Commerce a few months ago, was that there weren't any controls over it. It was just, particularly in the PPP, particularly within PPP, it was just raid the coffers. Neither party had any sort of idea on that. What I would have done is created an independent audit, or maybe given some additional resources to GAO to be able to go in and do that. But in the prior administration, you had gutting a lot of IG and audit functions, and kind of took the teeth out of GAO and the Office of Management and Budget to be able to oversee that and have what's called a manager's internal control program. So that led to a huge problem where the money was going into the wrong places, and a number of these companies, instead of pumping it back into the economy or keeping people hired, you had CEOs doing stock buybacks at that time as well.
Top of the news right now. What do you think should be done about gun violence in the United States?
This is a 90-10 issue. About 90% of Americans believe there should be something that you should have some sort of gun control measures. Now, I understand in this district, and being a gun owner myself, nobody's coming to take anybody's guns. It's impractical. It's not going to happen, and that's a constitutionally protected right. But we should do a number of things. First of all is universal background checks. I think something everybody can agree on is, you don't want somebody who's on a terrorist no-fly list or somebody who's had a violent felony record to be able to get a weapon, because that's sort of predictive behavior. That person is going to be a danger to society. You have that. I think that we should have better controls on assault-style weapons and gun education and training. When I was in the military, and I've probably shot more different types of weapons when I was in the military than most people have. I started off my career actually as an infantryman. And before you go out and use those weapons, you have to go qualify, you have to have gun safety, there are certain protocols that you have to have. And when my son was in the Boy Scouts, I actually taught gun safety to them and said, hey, look, there's a certain respect that you have to do this. So having people required to have gun safety and gun education is very important, because even when I was in combat, and I did 4 combat deployments, we always had rules of engagement. So yes, we had them, but we had a respect for them. We called them a weapon because it is a killing machine. That's why it was created, to close with and kill the enemy. The idea of giving teachers more guns, you're going to have more people that aren't trained that's going to use it, that's going to panic. That doesn't work. I've seen that in, forward deployed situations. It's like, why don't they give the civilians on our installation a weapon? Because they don't know how to use it. They don't know the defense plan. They don't know any of that stuff. So that is an addition. That's an additional problem. Now, on the right, they talk about, well, it's a mental health issue. Well, then let's address mental health as well. I tell people, hey, look, we need to address both of them, but nobody is. And these are issues that's agreed by the majority of Democrats, Republicans, independents, and gun owners, and even members of the NRA agree on this. Let's get a 90-10 issue here. Let's push something through. I hope it gets there done before I get to be, a freshman member of Congress. But let's get it done now. I think the public, no matter who they are, is crying out for it.
But a lot of progressives that I've talked to reject the idea of natural rights. Do you believe in natural rights?
I do, as in a practical sense. So this is where I come from, being a practical progressive. There is some of my philosophy that is based around classical liberalism, so I do, but in a practical sense. I think that we can kind of form and shape it the way that we need to.
And one of the things I wanted to ask about is, Roe v. Wade was decided on privacy grounds. Privacy is not explicitly in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. So one might argue that's a natural right. Do you think Roe v. Wade was correctly decided?
The original decision? Yes, I do believe that it was originally decided, because if you take a look at the 4th and the 14th, then what you have is in the 4th you do have an interpretation of a right to privacy. As Thurgood Marshall said, if a man's home is his castle, then his bedroom is sacrosanct. Then if we take a look at it like that, then yes, it is. And then the application of it with the 14th Amendment. Now, I know there's a lot of conservatives that have issue with the 14th Amendment. You can see them out there just discussing it willy-nilly. But the reason I believe that it has is that, when we, unless it is something that has to do with exigent circumstances, which is something the Supreme Court, both liberals and conservatives, have consistently upheld, the government should not have the ability to go in and regulate that. What is on your person, and it's my belief from a scientific sense, even a moral sense, that that is part of a woman's body until viability, and then so therefore it should be up to her to have that procedure, whatever that is. And that also gets with eliminating of any sort of trap laws that are out there, which would also hinder providers as well for any sort, and not just that, but any sort of medical procedure that's needed.
So as you know, the Declaration of, I'm sure you're familiar with this, the Declaration of Independence says we have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. John Locke said we had right to life, liberty, and property, which is not understood the way most people think that
It's correct. And I quote both. In fact, I was in Farmington the other night, and I was talking about this. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the belief that my rights begin where your rights end where my rights begin. So that kind of gets when we start talking about interpreting that in the sense of for the common defense and the general welfare, which is in Article 1 of the Constitution. It comes from the idea of Lockean liberalism, to where it's really the focus. It's really sort of an Enlightenment idea based around the self. But if we take a look at that, that's really where we're talking about the equality of opportunity. That's the difference between what I would consider those of us who are what I would call on the moderate left here in the United States versus versus what you would see, like I said, in something like Marxism. Most people throw around those terms; they don't even know what it means. It's like throwing around. They'll throw around these $5 words or terms, and you ask them what it is, and they can't tell you what it is. And so that's really what the difference is. It's creating an equality of opportunity, to live, quote unquote, the American dream. But yeah, the idea for life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's a concept that can span a lot of different things. You could take a look at your own body as your own property. I mean, as
that's
your
what John Locke meant.
Yes, exactly right. So that's where I was going with that. So if that's the case, that would be protections on such things as Roe, depending on what your interpretation is. So yeah, you can go along with that.
So the Declaration of Independence uses the more archaic language of all men. Mm-hmm. I take it to mean all people.
Yeah, same here.
Personhood. When does personhood begin?
So this is a great question. It's a great philosophical question and a theological question.
It's not a scientific question?
And it can be a scientific question too, depending on who you're talking about and framing it. So from a scientific perspective, it's when it would be viable outside of the womb. Now, this leads to some other issues when it comes viability. That is why when people talk about third trimester abortions, well, those like 99.9% of those are, like it was like what Pete Buttigieg said. Hey, this is a time when people have named the child, they've bought the clothes, they've made the room, they've done everything, and that's a very difficult decision when it comes to that. But it's when is viability. That needs to be a decision made between a doctor and a woman as to what is that based upon the situation. Because if a child is in there and it's not going to survive, then you have to ask that question. So it's kind of it's a moving scale when that is. Basically, it would basically be at birth is when that would happen, because that child is now living and breathing on his or her own, and going from there.
All persons have a right to due process, correct?
Correct.
So the moment of birth is completely arbitrary. Mm-hmm. So is somebody a person on one day and not the next on a completely arbitrary basis?
Are you talking about from the day they're born before the day before they're born?
Yes.
On that particular, I would say from a legal standpoint, at that particular, yes. I mean, not only is that from a scientific standpoint, that's also from a cultural standpoint. We look at birthdays. We take it from the day you entered into this, from you exited your mother's womb and you entered into this world. In a religious case, that is, they believe that is when the breathing in of the soul happens. So, that's the difference between one versus the other, because at that point you are completely, you're total functioning. The umbilical cord's cut. You're out. You're breathing on your own. And so forth and so on.
But science can also ensure a baby comes out of the womb healthy any day before a natural birthday. So to me, it just seems really arbitrary to base it on a random chance event that a person becomes a person scientifically.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one I don't think that a lot of us sit down and think about it. I think philosophically about this, and went through these things in my own mind. But you have to have a common baseline, because when you're creating the law, it's almost you have to go under Bentham's utilitarianism idea. So what's going to be the best for the most at that point, and in those particular cases, then you have to take a look at birth like that, because if not, we'd be going down to every single individual case, and governments at different levels, that's federal, state, local, that becomes practically the inability to be able to manage that. So there has to be a common baseline.
Well, I guess that's one reason I bring due process into the questions is we have a mechanism for dealing with due process when you have competing rights. Mm-hmm. You have, and one of my frustrations with how this debate is often played out in popular culture, mm-hmm. Through the media and whatnot, mm-hmm. is on the right, it's all based on moral and religious grounds, which mm-hmm. somebody who isn't moral and religious is never going to accept mm-hmm. that viewpoint. And on the left, the progressive side never talks about the possible rights, the equal rights. Late-term abortions are very rare. Mm-hmm. Couldn't there be due process taken before a judge if there's a dispute over whether an abortion is advisable?
You could, it needs to come from good scientific evidence. And I'm sort of an unusual progressive because, I not just take it from a scientific standpoint like a lot of progressives do, but I can even debate it on the other side where it comes from a moral and religious grounds as well, but from the other side of it. So when it's talking about protection of the actual living, breathing mother versus life versus potential life, and on the religious. In fact, I was having this debate with my business partner. He's progressive on everything but that one issue. And I talked to him about that. I said, hey, when does a soul enter the body? When you read into the Bible, and they go, at birth, when it's the breathing in. I said, okay, is that not the point? So if you take that from if you argue that from that standpoint, it's not that it gets turned on its head. You take a look at it at a different turn of the kaleidoscope. As well as if you take a look at it from a scientific standpoint, you can make the argument on either side as well. It's really where you have to find it from a legal standpoint, and I at that point I would leave it up to the science, and that's why in that particular case, it needs to be in that case it needs to be a private medical decision on when that is, and it's since. The only other way to test it is to, have a woman to go into labor at 7 months. Okay, is the child going to do it? Almost like an experiment, and that's, ethically and morally wrong to try to do that. So yeah, because I hear this. Well, what if a child's born premature? I said, okay, that's fine. At that point, it's with the aid of a lot of scientific discovery, we can keep that child alive and to live on and to thrive. In some cases, you can't. So, that's why we have to go with the birth, and we have to use we have to have a common baseline. So you can look at it from both sides. You can look at it through the criteria of both sides, and you can look at it through both prisms on either side of the argument. And so, that being said, you know, we need to take a look at it scientifically at that point. New York is the most Ukrainian state in the country. The most Ukrainian city in the most Ukrainian state, and in the district, but it was where I used to be running, and that's in Syracuse. So here in central and western New York, we have a large Ukrainian population. I actually spoke to the Ukrainian community, and I asked them, I said, what does our response need to be? And the first thing they said was close the skies. Well, the best way to do that is giving them the equipment and giving them the training. My background, I worked in several NATO operations in my career, both funding them and executing them. If we start to get involved with our forces, you have just probably created World War III at that point. So getting the military aid in there is important, and getting the humanitarian aid. What we did in Iraq, and we did a lot of things wrong, but here's one thing we learned about it, is so when we start taking a look at this asset forfeitures and seizing, investing of these oligarchs' property and monies around the world, one thing we did in Iraq was we took that money and the problem was we as the government spent it on behalf of the Iraqi people. What we need to do is give it to people like President Zelensky, Mayor Klitschko in Kyiv, and ask them, how do you need to rebuild this? How do you need to use it? So we're not coming in with the U.S. and NATO coming in with the heavy hand going, this is the way it needs to be done. No, give it to them how they best think it should be used to rebuild their country and to outfit them. But that military aid is essential at this point, but it's training them and having them doing it under what we have, what's called a train and equip authority, which is a completely different discussion. But that's what the U.S. response should be. Our relations with China should be wary, and for two reasons. First of all, one of the biggest problems we had in neoliberalism and neoconservatism was the shipping of jobs overseas. And we're coming to see that here. That's something that started, 35, 40 years ago, starting with the Reagan administration on, where we started to outsource and ship jobs over to China. Well, we're paying for that right now. So we need to bring that back. Okay, so when we talk about the rebuilding rural America, strengthening unions, that's part of it, is bringing those jobs back here. So that's number one. Second is that recently the Biden administration came out and talked about the protection of Taiwan, because if we see what's going on in Russia with Ukraine, China has some of the same mind about Taiwan. So it's strengthening and hardening Taiwan. What happened a few days ago that isn't getting a whole lot of mention in the press is when President Biden was on his Asian tour with the Indians, Japanese, I believe it was the Australians, I think it was the Australians. They were there. The Russians and the Chinese are having joint military exercises where they flew a nuclear bomber directly over where the president was. So that's why I'm saying we have to be very wary of China, because it could be, the autocrats of the world versus people that believe in democracy. And whereas traditionally Russia and China have, with the old Sino-Soviet relations, didn't get along, it's like, hey, look, we're both autocrats here. Let's work together to bring down the United States, Western Europe, and any of their allies. So that's something we have to do. We have to be very wary of them. We need to have less economic reliance on them, bring our jobs back here, employ more Americans, and reverse the tide on that. I look forward to bringing some fresh leadership, a fresh set of eyes to things. since living here in New York, I've came to love it. It's my home. And I love it as much as I love my dear wife that, we've been married, almost 16 years before. We need to come together. There are more that brings us together than what divides us. There's a common sense of humanity that's there that I believe we can bring back. And we need to rally around the truth. Too many people get out there, they live in their bubble. They get their news and their information from a couple things and get disinformation. We need to tell what the truth is, and we cannot be afraid of what that is. So continuing out this campaign, I'm going to be calling out truth and what actually happened. And if you elect me and give me the honor of being your congressman, that's what you're going to get from me from day one. From me and my team is you're going to get honesty, you're going to get the truth, and we're going to shoot straight with you, whether that's an uncomfortable truth or not. And then we find it. Bad news is not like fine wine or cheese. It doesn't get better with time. We solve the problem, we work together, and then we move on to the next issue. So I want to thank everybody, the good people here of Genesee County. Every time here, I'm welcomed greatly when I come in, and I look forward to being out here even more.